Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Hairston. I am a staff attorney at Advancement Project's National Office. Welcome to the Fall 2018 Ohio Voter Protection webinar. So before I get into the substance of this presentation, I'd like to give a shout out to a group of anchor organizations that have made this series possible. In addition to Advancement Project, we have the NAACP, the National Urban League, the National Congress of American Indians, Demos, Race Forward, Unidos US, the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. We are a host of organizations committed to racial justice that are funded in part by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which made this series possible. So we'll go ahead and get started. So a little bit more about Advancement Project. We are a national racial justice organization that focuses on using legal communications and organizing strategies to build power in communities of color, and all with the goal of eliminating structural racism in the United States. You can learn more about us at our website, advancementproject.org. In addition to a few other program areas, Advancement Project houses a Power and Democracy program. That Power and Democracy program, of which I'm a member, is focused on equal access to the polls and increasing equal access to the polls for Black and Brown communities and ensuring that their voices are fully heard in American democracy. Again, my name is Andrew Hairston. I'm honored to be your host for this webinar series. I am a staff attorney at Advancement Project's National Office. I'm only licensed to practice law in Louisiana, but this webinar series, this presentation in particular, was reviewed by an Ohio barred attorney for general accuracy. And I'd like to give a shout out to my supervising attorney, Dania Judge, who also reviewed. Why do we vote? A very pressing question for a perilous political era. It is something that has remained an inquiry for Black and Brown communities throughout the history of the United States. Certainly, why we vote as an avenue to dignity and to self-determination, recognizing the ills of the past and the history of racial discrimination of various forms that folks of color have had to endure in America. The right to vote serves as a critical way to address those ills and shape a society for generations to come that is the most optimal for those generations. So there is a Supreme Court case that was decided after the Civil War during what is called the Reconstruction era of American history. And during that period, African Americans acquired some gains in political participation and civic engagement, but there also was a significant backlash, perhaps because of this idea espoused in a case called Yickwa versus Hopkins. The case says that voting is regarded as a fundamental political right because it is preservative of all rights. By voting, folks are able to weigh in on education, on housing policy, on access to employment. It really is a right that influences our society, how it governs, and the resources that are made available to its citizens and to all within its borders. Particularly in the case of Ohio, and as we've reeled from a host of police killings over the past decade, our vote gives voice to Tamir Rice, a young man in Cleveland who was shot and killed by a police officer in November 2014. Unfortunately, a person who will never be able to vote and whose legacy we continue on through our active participation in democracy. So for the recognition of the racial discrimination that was alluded to earlier, and a lot of the hurdles that Black and brown folks faced during the Reconstruction era, during the early 20th century with Jim Crow laws, and gearing up for the civil rights movement. There was really a watershed moment that occurred in 1965, 53 years ago, after the tireless work of civil rights activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and Ralph Abernathy. President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. Now, this law provided a host of protections that were intended to be covered by the Civil War amendments, but to have these protections enshrined in federal law was really a significant moment. And so the Voting Rights Act is something that we should keep in mind going through this presentation. Now, with this watershed moment, there also is a backlash similar to what Black and brown folks experienced in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Currently, we see a host of voter suppression laws that have popped up, particularly in the past 5 years, since the Supreme Court announced a case called Shelby County versus Holder, which essentially gutted what's called the pre-clearance formula of the Voting Rights Act. Essentially, states that had histories of racial discrimination had to apply to the federal government before they could implement certain changes to their voting laws. And Shelby County, that decision did away with that process. In the 5 years since that announcement, a host of strict voter ID laws have popped up across the country. There's been elimination of same-day registration and early voting, and we see these fights being waged on many fronts throughout the country. So voting is more imperative than ever. So with all of that in mind, the historical context of racial discrimination in voting and some of the achievements that have been made by the work of community advocates and organizers, we can get into the mechanics of registering to vote in Ohio, and we'll delve into the substance of that. So a few baseline requirements to start off in terms of registering to vote in Ohio. One must be 18 years old, a resident of Ohio, a U.S. citizen as well, and one must have been a resident of Ohio for at least 30 days. So this next point, not being incarcerated for a felony conviction, that is a requirement, but there is some nuance to that I'll explain. A person must not have been declared mentally incapacitated, and a person must not have been permanently disenfranchised for violating election laws. So concerning that, incarceration for a felony conviction, bullet point, generally folks on probation and parole in Ohio, as well as those who have returned to their communities from prison sentences, are eligible to vote. So it's only those who are currently serving a prison term for a felony conviction who are not able to vote. There are a few options for registering to vote where folks can go to do this. There is an online website called myohiovote.com that has a host of resources, as well as this specific link that will take a person to a voter registration application online. Ohioans also have the option of filling out a voter registration application by pen and mailing it in to the Secretary of State's office or to the local Board of Elections. And then once the form is completed, again, it can be mailed to that Board of Elections that governs your county, and you can find your Board of Elections at this link here. A few voter registration materials and deadlines to keep in mind. So once you do successfully submit your voter registration application, your local board of elections will send you a voter information card. An important thing to keep in mind is that this card cannot be used for voter ID. We'll get into the list of acceptable forms of voter ID in a minute. But it will provide you with your polling place and information on day of election voting. And for this upcoming November 2018 election, the deadline to register to vote is 30 days prior to the election. That translates to October 9th, 2018. Now, there is a period of early voting in Ohio from October 10th through November 5th, 2018, and we'll get into that more soon. So once you do receive that voter information card in the mail, you can check your voter registration online as well. And it's optimal to do it at least a week before the election. So you can either go to myohiovote.com or you can go to this specific link and check your voter registration. You can also reach out to your local board of elections, the entity that sent the voter registration card to you, to double check that you are registered to vote for the November 2018 election. So there is early in-person voting in Ohio, and it begins on Wednesday, October 10th, the day after the voter registration deadline, and includes weekends leading up to the Monday before the election, November 5th. Now, hours generally vary for early voting, so we urge you to check the voting schedule at this link. And you can also reach out to your local board of elections for times and locations for early voting. Now, we understand that life happens, that a person may have to move before election day, either to another county or within the same county. And so if that does happen prior to election day, particularly prior to the registration deadline, an Ohioan can update their address online at this link. And this does have to be done 30 days prior to election day in keeping up with the voter registration deadline. So by October 9th, you can update your address online. Now, with all of this pre-election information in mind, let's move on to election day and what will happen on November 6th. So there are several forms of valid voter ID that you can use in Ohio, starting with an Ohio driver's license or a state-issued ID card. You can also use identification issued by the United States government, such as a passport or military identification. A bank statement is also acceptable. In addition to those, one can use a current paycheck, a current government check, or a current government document with the voter's name and address on it, as well as a utility bill. Now, generally for the purposes of current, and its definition under Ohio election law, these documents need to be within 12 months old. So anything within a year old will be considered current. So absentee ballots are another option that Ohioans may use on or before election day. Absentee indicates that you will not vote in person, that you will mail in your ballot. Generally, Ohioans can request absentee ballots at any time, but the deadline to request an absentee ballot is 3 days prior to the election. So there is an online link where you can request an absentee ballot, and these ballots need to be postmarked, need to be put in the mail by Monday, November 5th, or either hand delivered to your local board of elections, that entity that sent you the voter registration information card, by Tuesday, November 6th at 7:30 p.m. And that's when the polls close. So a little bit more on election day hours and procedures. The polls will be open for 13 hours on Election Day. They'll open at 6:30 a.m. and close at 7:30 p.m. And generally, if you are waiting in line at 7:30 p.m., you have and will have an opportunity to cast a ballot, whether it's a traditional ballot or what we call provisional or temporary, and more on that soon. Generally, political activities are prohibited within 100 feet of the entrance of a polling place. And usually there will be some type of marker to say that a certain area is within 100 feet of the polling place. And political activities generally includes T-shirts endorsing candidates or endorsing issue voting. And then to find your polling place, again, you can check your local Board of Elections at this link. So Ohioans have access to assistance with voting at the polls. Ohio voters can request assistance from anyone at the polls except for three major exceptions: an employer, an agency of an employer, a union representative, and then there's another requirement, a candidate on the ballot in a voter's precinct or that local area where you vote. So those four categories of folks generally cannot provide assistance. Polling places throughout Ohio will generally have accessible voter systems in the form of touchscreen devices that are Americans with Disabilities Act ADA compliant. And then also, depending on the policies of one's assisted living or nursing home facility, if an Ohio voter lives in one, Ohioans may be able to participate in supervised voting from within the facility. Now, what happens if someone's challenged at the polls, something that may come up? Now, even as an Ohio voter, if you don't have an approved form of voter ID, you should be allowed to cast that provisional or temporary ballot. If you specifically find your voter eligibility being challenged, you can consult with what's called a precinct election official, more on that very soon, to get that provisional ballot and cast it. And, provisional ballots, although they're temporary, should be counted as regular ones once the identity of the voter is confirmed. So a little bit more on provisional ballots. If you are required to vote by provisional ballot because you didn't have a valid form of ID, one of those listed earlier in the presentation, you must appear in front of your local Board of Elections to provide proof of ID. So whether it's a utility bill, a bank statement, an Ohio ID card, within 7 days of Election Day by November 13th. And if someone challenges a voter's eligibility at the polls, there might be another person present who says that on information and belief, this person is not eligible to vote at this precinct, at this particular place. And if an election official determines that the voter is ineligible, the voter must provide identification or documentation that what's called would resolve the challenge. Generally, a provisional voter would be required to attest or perhaps sign a document to their belief that they are registered to vote when they cast a provisional ballot. So a note about college students voting in Ohio. They generally can. College students in Ohio can register to vote using the campus address or the campus that they use, the address that they use to receive correspondence from their university or their college. This must be done at least 30 days prior to the election, the October 9th deadline. And an Ohio ID is not required to complete this process. And keep in mind that the definition of college is fairly broad. Any accredited institution of higher education, ranging from a community college to a state university, can qualify. So the term precinct election official came up. In other states, it might be referred to as a poll worker, but precinct election officials generally have to be registered voters, and they are paid positions. They play a very critical role in ensuring fair election administration and ensuring that things go smoothly on election day. As an Ohio voter, you can sign up to be a precinct election official at this link here through the Secretary of State's website. Now, there's a fine line between being challenged, as we discussed in the case of having to cast a provisional ballot, and voter intimidation. And there are various forms of voter intimidation that someone may encounter at the polls as they go to vote in Ohio. So it can range from being shouted at or having abusive language directed toward you, toward the voter. Someone repeatedly asking about a person's citizenship status, someone lying about being an election official and deliberately spreading misinformation about voting requirements, someone bringing a gun to a polling place, and then misleading posts on social media. So in the days leading up to the election, you may see on Twitter or Facebook, someone posts, oh, well, people of this party affiliation vote on this day, and folks of other party affiliations vote on another day. And that is a form of a misleading post on social media. It's also important to keep in mind that as an Ohio voter, you may encounter police officers who are at these precincts or polling places where you go to vote. And it's also important to keep in mind that the presence of these law enforcement officers should not hinder you from exercising your right to vote and from participating in democracy in this way. Now, what to do when one encounters those forms of voter intimidation, whether listed on the previous screen or if it takes another form. You can document the occurrence by taking notes or capturing it with a picture. You can report the activity to a precinct election official or poll worker and the Board of Elections. You can also report the intimidation to what's called the National Election Protection Coalition. The Advancement Project is a member of a nationwide coalition that seeks to ensure fair election administration throughout the country during various elections. You can visit 866rvote.org or call 866-687-8683. And then you can also consult with local advocacy organizations and precinct election officials to determine what next steps may be available. So a few thoughts on strategic engagement ahead of the election, and we're getting close to the conclusion. So you can meet with your county Board of Elections or Supervisor of Elections at least 45 days prior to the election. That's coming up soon. You can also monitor voter purges. So there is a federal law signed in the early 1990s called the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, that prohibits election officials from conducting mass purges within 90 days of a federal general election. So using that tool that's available on the Secretary of State's website, if you find that a number of people in your community are going to verify their voter registration and are saying that they are not enrolled and not registered, it might be a broader purge that has occurred by the local Board of Elections, and this federal law prevents that from happening, from mass purges happening, and it's something to keep in mind. And then you can also encourage community members to sign up to become precinct election officials on election day. Now, one more point on the NVRA. In the last Supreme Court term, the October 2017 term, the court decided a case called Husted versus A. Philip Randolph Institute that emerged from Ohio concerning something called the Ohio Supplemental Process. Under that provision, it has to do with the NVRA. If a person did not vote for a certain amount of time it would set off a trigger. And if the person did not vote for a few more years after that trigger was set off, they would be removed from the voter rolls. Now, the Supreme Court did rule in favor of the Ohio Secretary of State in this case and held that the Ohio supplemental process was permissible. But also important to note that 6 years would have had to have taken place or elapsed before a person could be removed from the rolls under the Ohio supplemental process. And despite that ruling, the provisions and protections of the NBRA largely remain in place for the November 2018 election. So several final steps and concluding thoughts, particularly as you're scheduling meetings with your local boards of elections and setting up these conversations. A few questions that you can pose. Have you consolidated or closed any polling places? And where are those polling places located? How do you notify voters about these polling place changes and closings? What are some of the common problems observed when processing voter registration applications, just to be proactive? What happens if a registrant's information does not match the information in the state or federal database that you use to verify identity? Under what circumstances will voters be removed from the voter rolls in advance of the November 2018 election? And how will voters be notified of emergency polling place changes on election day? A few other questions to pose to the Board of Elections. How are voter registration applications processed if mailed before but received after the deadline of October 9th? How you respond to poll workers, precinct election officials, and/or challengers in the polling place who insist on improperly challenging voters. Again, that line between a challenge and harassing someone, shouting at them, or repeatedly asking them about their citizenship status. And if one observes problems at the polls on election day, is there a direct number that can be called to reach the local Board of Elections? A few other thoughts on getting further involved ahead of the election. You can organize a community meeting to review registration deadlines and polling place changes. You can review the requirements for registering voters to vote, and then also consider becoming a precinct election official on November 6th on election day. So at this point, before we do conclude, we want to open up the space for questions that you might have, and feel free to use the Q&A tool to ask any questions. Okay, great. Well, if any questions do arise, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at ahairston@advancementproject.org. You can also be reached at AP's office, 202-728-9557. And you can also follow Advancement Project on social media, ADV_project, for updates on our voter protection work ahead of the November 2018 election and other initiatives we're involved in, particularly our Power and Democracy program. To that end, you can also visit nationalrighttovote.org for more voter protection updates from Advancement Project and to see our work as it continues to unfold. Just one final thought as we get close to conclusion. This was reviewed by an Ohio licensed attorney, this presentation, but was not meant to be legal advice, nor was it supposed to create an attorney-client relationship. It was only framed as general advice to be helpful ahead of the November 2010 election. So with that, we just want to thank you for tuning in to this webinar. We hope it's been helpful, and please do stay in touch, and we wish you all the best as you prepare for the November 2018 election. Take care.